I want to move on to this, Ryan, before we get to some of the most important players or most interesting players in the Eastern Conference teams with you that I didn't get to you before. But this story that kind of piqued my interest was the Anthony Bennett story. He got released from the Rockets. He was a former number one overall pick. This is a guy who, I mean, he was a surprising number one overall pick in 2013. It wasn't considered a great draft then. I believe Oladipo went 2 in that draft, and I think Giannis was also in that draft as well. But those, nobody thought that it was talked that this wasn't a star-driven draft, that the top was very weak. And so when Anthony Davis or Anthony Bennett, I'm sorry, went 1, it was a big surprise even so then, even if there wasn't star power at the top. But I want to ask you, as a former GM, how, like, this guy, we've seen busts in the league before. We've seen the Kwame Browns. We've seen different guys become busts. And, they still sort of play in the league, but they didn't really meet the expectations that came with the number one pick. It almost seemed like immediately Anthony Bennett, like, could not play in the league. Like, from day one, even in, like, the preseason, people were like, whoa, this doesn't look very good. How is that possible? Like, how could a team do that much scouting on a guy and that much interviewing and watch that much tape? And how could he literally not even be able to play in the NBA almost from day one?
Well, that's a great question, Steve, and I'll give you an interesting story about that. So that was my first year as GM of the Phoenix Suns. We had the 5th pick in the draft, and we were actually talking to the Cleveland Cavaliers about a potential trade. And I don't want to go into specifically what the offer was, but we offered the 5th pick plus a few other things to get up to get the number 1 pick, and we were going to draft the guy you mentioned who went to Orlando with the number 2 pick, who's now playing very well for the Indiana Pacers when he's healthy. So we were looking at that, and long story short, we called the Cavaliers. David Stern was a commissioner at the time and had put Cleveland on the clock to start the draft. And we called the Cavaliers and thought we might have a deal and that we would be picking number 1. The Cavs called back. I don't want to say who it was in their front office. It was not Chris Grant, their GM, but one of Chris Grant's lieutenants called back and said, no deal. And I said, okay, like, who are you guys taking at number 1? The draft's started. You guys are on the clock. The 5-minute countdown clock has started. And the guy said, I'm not sure yet. And I said, what do you mean you're not sure? Like, you've had the number 1 pick for a month and a half now. You've worked all these guys out. You've interviewed them. So I bring that up, Steve, not to pick on Cleveland or the Cavs, but even on the clock in a process they've been preparing for months. They scouted, for a year or more. They still did not know who they were going to take. They took Anthony Bennett. One of the interesting things there, and I feel badly for him if this is true, is that Chris Grant, the general manager at the time, reportedly did not want to take Anthony Bennett number 1. He was in the minority and got overruled. That's why it's hard being in a front office sometimes. Even if you have the president's title or the GM title, you're not always the ultimate decision maker. And unfortunately, I know that pretty well from firsthand experience. But yeah, that was, with Anthony Bennett. I've never seen a team with the number 1 pick, be or seem uncertain, even on the clock, as far as who they were going to take.
Wow, that's fascinating. So even if you're the GM or the president of a team, that doesn't really give you autonomy. That doesn't give you final say, essentially, to be like, no, this is the guy we're taking. You can still be outruled. I mean, obviously, different organizations have different rules and things like that, but you can literally say, no, I'm the GM of this team. I want to take a different player and be overruled by other people in the organization.
Yeah, I mean, think of it this way, Steve. I mean, your house, if I come to your house and don't like the furniture, you own it, or assuming you don't rent it. But if you did own the house, you're the owner. You own it. It's your show, whether I like it or not. So that's the challenge. Like you said, every organization operates differently. I was in the league 16 years and worked with 2 teams, but how they were owned and operated and managed between Boston and Phoenix was very different. With ownership influence, and especially in the big decision-making process, that was kind of night and day between the Celtics and Suns.
So did you try to go up to 2 and get Oladipo then? Did you talk to the Magic at all? Like, how did that work? And did they just shut you down?
Yeah, we did. We did. We tried at 1 and then couldn't get 1, tried 2, just because there was so much uncertainty in that draft, Steve. And, I felt like Oladipo was the guy that I was pretty certain. I didn't know how good he was going to be, but I knew he was going to be pretty good and solid. And, it took a while. Obviously, he wasn't the same player, or he wasn't the player in Orlando and OKC that he is now in Indiana, where he's broken out to become a star and potentially even a superstar. It took him a little while, but I loved his work ethic. I loved his character. Getting back to Anthony Bennett, there were some questions about Anthony as far as what Scal was talking about earlier, his commitment to the game, his passion for the game, and there were also some pretty significant medical concerns, Steve, going back to his time at UNLV.
Yeah, the whole thing is just amazing to me that, like, it's just there can be all this money and scouting and effort put into this, and it can be that bad. Because I think I don't think it's ridiculous to say that he might be the biggest bust in the history of the NBA. I mean, just granted, like, there have been busts, like I mentioned, Kwame Brown and different guys, who still played in the league, who still had roles in the league. And Anthony Davis has been a fringe player and hasn't even really been able to crack a 12-man roster really for most of the last part of his career. So it's pretty wild that a number one pick, you have the pick of the litter for anyone that you want, and it can go that poorly. But again, that goes back to the conversation we had earlier this week, just about like how much of a crapshoot sometimes the NBA draft is. And I think that's what kind of makes it interesting, because you're projecting on these guys that are 18, 19 years old about how their bodies will be and what their attitude will be like. And, I know me at 18 years old, I didn't necessarily have like the same attitude I have now about life. And, people change, and it must be just absolutely impossible to sort of project that going forward.